It's really important before you even think about drafting or having your lawyers draft an IGDTA for you, that you really know actually what the data flows are. You need to kind of dig down and clarify what's happening, what data is being shared with who, for what purposes.
So today we've been asked to come and explain a bit more to the viewers about what IGDTAs are. What does that even stand for?
So an IGDTA is an intra-group data transfer agreement. It's effectively just a contract that documents and explains any kind of rules around the sharing of data or the transfer of data between two or more entities. So if you've got a group of companies and you've got lots of different entities and there's data flowing around them, then an IGDTA can be used to document that and to make sure that you're ticking certain boxes.
That's useful. And, a lot of clients ask us, are we even sharing data? They don't seem to be too sure if that's definitely what's taking place. Can you give some examples of, when that might be the case?
Yeah, so quite often at the outset, clients don't think there's actually data sharing taking place, but once you scratch the surface, you tend to find out that there is. Obvious instances tend to be where there is, for example, an IT function that sits within a group of entities. So you've got one entity that is the one that holds the license for certain software that's used by the full group, or you've got all data for the group is actually hosted on a server that's owned by one entity. Therefore, that data is being transferred from the other entities into that one entity. So that's an intra-group data transfer. Other situations that are very common are where your HR function sits within a specific group, might be within the parent group of a group of companies. In that situation, you're going to have people employed in the HR team in that entity who will be accessing or being handed data relating to various members of staff from across the group from loads of different entities. Both those situations mean that there's intra-group data transfers taking place, and they're ones where you might need to think about having something in place to document that.
That's really useful. So when we are looking at the different sharing that's happening, what legal requirements do clients need to start thinking about?
So that really depends on the type of data that's being shared or transferred between around the group. Where there's personal data involved, because it's not always personal data, it might just be business data, certain details that have to flow to let the business operate. But where there's personal data involved, you've got to think about the data protection principles. So things like fairness and lawfulness. So you're only using the data in a way that is fair and lawful. Transparency. So the individuals to whom the data relates are actually aware of what's happening with their data and the fact that it's being shared or could potentially be shared with other group members for certain purposes. You've got to think about security, because you don't just want to let anybody within another group entity access certain data. So you need to make sure that it's that there are constraints and protections around the data so that any sharing is secure. And you also need to think about I think another key one, data minimization, probably in this context, because again, if one entity needs to see certain data, you should just give them access to a full file of somebody's information. You need to make sure that you're limiting it to only the data that is absolutely necessary. There's also going to be situations where there'll be different dynamics in place between the entities that are sharing the data. So when I say sharing, in the context of sharing, I usually mean a controller to controller basis. So you're each acting independently as controllers, you're each deciding what you use the data for. So one entity gives another entity data and says, here you go, use it for your purpose, but you basically do as you need to for that purpose. The other side, the other dynamic you often come across is controller to processor, and that's a data processing relationship where one entity is the controller. They decide what data they're giving to the other, what they're to do with it, and they give it to them on instructions to do a certain thing with that data, and that's a different dynamic. And when you've got a controller to processor relationship in play, you need to make sure that you're ticking certain mandatory requirements set out in the legislation. So it tends to mean that it needs to be a bit more wordy, the contract, when you're covering off those situations.
Oh, that's great. And then, like you say, as part of meeting those principles under particular data protection legislation, you want to think about then documenting that. So that's when then the IGDTA comes in place then.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important before you even think about drafting or having your lawyers draft an IGDTA for you, that you really know actually what the data flows are. You need to kind of dig down and clarify what's happening, what data is being shared with who, for what purposes, what actually needs to happen. When you do that, if there's, you need to think about things like international elements. So in your group of companies, you might have entities sitting within the UK, you might have them within Europe, which is perfectly safe from a data protection perspective to share data with them. But if you've got data sitting in other territories that are considered to be restricted territories, then you need to build in additional safeguards there, again, just to make sure that the data and the transfer is secure, is safe, and by having an IGDTA in place, you can build in the sort of standard terms that you use for those transfers to the IGDTA and just get the correct mechanics in place to make sure that you can actually allow data to flow as freely as it needs to around your group of companies, your organisation, to allow business to operate the way it needs to.
That's great. I think that's really useful. Like I say, just to touch on it a bit here, and explain to clients, but I know you've written an article on this as well in the Data Bandwidth series. But thanks for your time, Jen, and for going over that with me today. It's helpful.
Thank you, Tori.